Okay, hi, welcome to week 2 of SOC224, Research Ethics. I've redone the mind map so that it's much clearer and able to be read at a high level at quite a distance. If we look at this now, you can see that what we're going to do today is basically talk through the guiding values of research ethics, what we mean by privacy and some of the basic concepts there. We'll talk about what are the elements of informed consent and an informed consent form, and then some other fundamental concepts. And then we're also just going to briefly deal with the forms that I've uploaded that are related to our study. But let's get straight into it. Try and make this quick. So yeah, this is the fifth bit. We're going to look at the key documents for our study, or at least I've uploaded those to iLearn. So okay, that's the end of slide 1. That's slide 1. We're going to go to slide 2, which is guiding values, and that basically ends up we talk about four main guiding values. Those are research, merit, and integrity, autonomy, beneficence, and justice. I'll go into these in turn, but I think one of the main things to say here is that these are not exactly perfectly mutually exclusive concepts. In ethics and morality, as is with in maths as well, and many other areas, you can get to the same answer or the same right thing to do, irrespective of the direction you come to it from. And so it turns out that justice and autonomy tend to point towards doing the same thing, and beneficence, which is doing good, also tends to doing the same types of things. So if it feels like there's overlap in the examples, it's because there is. So let's jump straight in. So we're going to slide 3 now. Research, merit, and integrity. So one of the ways I like to lecture is to try to capture a concept in a word or a phrase. And so in this case, I would say research, merit, and integrity can be captured by the concept or the phrase high quality and honest research. And some sort of examples of what that means in the concrete are things like that researchers should be qualified. And I'll point out that that was one of the big issues that the university had with me putting this application, is that you all count as novice researchers. So are you qualified enough to be able to do research with a population where you may come across illegal behavior? So that's one example. Another one is if you do it without enough funding or not enough resources. You're supposed to have done a comprehensive literature review before you do it, so you don't repeat what has been done before. You should do the research with honesty, meaning that you don't make up data or misrepresent your own data. And you should use the best methods in the world, really appropriate methods. Some non-examples in this case simply meaning examples of how you could do something without research, merit, and integrity would be to commit plagiarism, so copying other people's work, to falsify data, to not have any contribution to knowledge, to repeat past experiments but with inferior methods, or to not do a literature review. And one of the points around all of this is simply that if you are going to use up participants' time, if you are potentially going to risk some of their interests, then there needs to be integrity and merit behind the research. If there's not integrity and merit, then at the very least the research should have cause absolutely no risk of harm beyond what people experience in everyday lives, but actually probably there's not even a good reason to do it in the first place. Okay, so that's value number 1 that lies behind research ethics. The second one is the one that you would all know and be all quite familiar with. It's called autonomy or respect, but really it comes down to particularly informed consent and protecting people from risks. In a phrase, you could call this, I call it the intrinsic value of all humans, or humans have the right to control and protection. Another, in one word, we could just call it courtesy, courtesy to other human beings. So examples of how this is implemented in the process of research ethics is obtaining informed consent, so people know what they're doing and they agree to it, and if they say no, that's respected. There's the protection from risks or undue risks of participants. So there is limits on how much people can consent to things that really are just not in their interests. We also can say we treat people with courtesy and respect when we treat them as people who are deserving of empowerment. So if they're from, for example, well, anyone, but particularly if they're from some sort of underprivileged group, they deserve to be empowered in the process of research and in controlling their lives to the extent that that is possible and a reasonable request of researchers. And they also deserve help, right? So if you are doing research around a topic and the research knows that these are a group that has particular needs, then if the research can help them, it should help them. Okay, so some ways that you can, the non-examples or ways that you can do research without showing respect and autonomy and courtesy to the research participants are things like coercion. If you use coercion, if you use deception, if you treat people like they're objects, not subjects, not human beings, you treat them as a means to an end, particularly a means to your research or your self-aggrandizement or your satisfaction of your own curiosity. And also if you engage in a very utilitarian logic. So you may say, well, this is going to help all low-wage workers, so I don't need to care about the particular low-wage worker that I'm doing research on. So having a utilitarian, a sort of a calculation that the greater good will be served, even if it might harm individuals' rights. And there's only very limited circumstances where that sort of a logic is really acceptable in research. Okay, so the third concept we're going to deal with is a weird word that I only really learnt once I did research ethics, beneficence, or to be beneficent. It basically means do good. That's what beneficence means. It's an approach to your life or to an activity of doing good. Another word for it is to do no harm, which is a slightly lower bar than doing good. And this is a concept that goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks, 2,000 years ago, the Hippocratic Oath for doctors, which is to do no harm. Well, researchers basically have to make the same commitment. So the way we do this is by doing things like minimizing risks, making sure the benefits of a study outweigh the risks, both for the individual and also for the whole study or society as a whole. We commit to not harming participants, and we also ensure that everyone gets treatment as good as the current state of the art. So, for example, it would be unethical in our research on low-wage migrant workers to somehow study what happens to workers if they are kept ignorant and don't know about their rights. That would, like if we were to let half the workers know about their rights and half the workers not know about their rights, or offer help to half the workers and not offer any help to half the workers, that would be seen as intrinsically cruel and doing harm. Even though it is simply through the absence, it's still a form of harm. At least most research committees would see it that way. Some non-examples or ways of doing research that do not show beneficence are things like doing dangerous research, research that risks serious harm to employment, to having legal consequences, to the physical integrity of our participants, or to damage the emotions of our participants. If we denied them access to treatment, or we consciously disadvantaged one group, as I discussed before, and or if we let the data, for example, private data become public. We'd promised them confidentiality or privacy, and we couldn't keep that. Okay. That's the third value. And the fourth value is what's called justice. This one probably seems a little bit weird. And the reason it probably seems a bit weird is because justice can mean 1,000 different things to 1,000 different people. In the context of research ethics, it really is very closely related to the notion of respect, but it's saying that the respect needs to be done in a way that treats all human beings and as equal. They should be treated equally. So if a benefit is offered to one, it should be offered to all. And so I've already sort of discussed a bit of this under beneficence, but so if you have a placebo or control group, so if you have a group that gets the treatment but not gets, and another group that gets no treatment or gets a fake treatment, you need to make sure that the benefits of getting the placebo or the control are similar to those of the experimental group. So if you know that the experimental treatment might be like giving people $100 and it really might help them, then the placebo or the control treatment should be something equivalent. So maybe giving them $100 but in a different form, maybe $100 worth of food rather than just $100 in cash. For example, this is particularly true, as you probably know, in research like around medical research, so you can't really give people substandard care. There's also the necessity to show justice in terms of which communities get the benefits of research. So you can't really justify ethically doing research, particularly on a poor community, that is only going to benefit rich communities. For example, if you do research on a patentable drug and you experiment on a whole lot of people in Africa and then charge them the equivalent of a month's income for a day's supply of the AIDS treatment, then those communities which suffered from the experimentation, which bore the risks of experimentation, are just not going to get access to it. And this would be seen as highly unethical by most research committees. And lastly, that you should ensure that the risks are spread across individuals. So for example, if you're researching, like if you're doing research that is risky, it's a key thing that you do that you don't only do research on poor people because they're super cheap to research on, right? Because often you can get poor people to do research, or vulnerable communities to do research for relatively little payment. And that is exploiting them, and it goes against the principle of justice. So I've given, the non-examples that I've listed here are basically what I've already talked about: experimenting on poor people because they're cheap, studying only vulnerable populations, unless it's particularly appropriate for your research, which in our case, I guess it is in terms of low-wage workers, not distributing benefits of the research to the studied population, and not doing research on poor people for the benefit of researchers. Researching on poor people for the benefit of the researchers and rich communities, like the medical example. One aspect of justice in the study that we're doing for this course, which I think is very interesting, is that we are doing research, and I guess this is also about beneficence, and it's also about respect and autonomy, but we are under an obligation to publish our results to try to improve, to the extent that they can improve the conditions of low-wage workers in Australia. So this is an example of us. We are not just doing academic research, and this is one of the reasons why the data you collect is not just going to be used for your projects, but it's actually also going to be used as part of a larger, part of research that I will be publishing, probably with NGOs and other organizations, that will be policy documents and research that will be available to a much larger group. Probably, for example, on one day I might write a book. I'll definitely try and write journal articles and reports on the conditions of low-wage workers and what issues they suffer, what their position is, and how that could be improved. So that's a really classic example, and when I actually had to meet with ethics committee yesterday for about 3 hours about this study, and when I did that, it was really clear that it was important that the data that you are collecting as students is actually going to be shared with me so that it can be published, and ethics were very clear about this, because it almost wouldn't be justified studying a vulnerable population just for the purposes of giving you guys interesting research experience for your course. So again, that's an example of justice and beneficence and autonomy. Okay, so that's the end of guiding values. Remember them again, they are research, merit, and integrity, which basically means do quality, honest research. Autonomy, which basically means show courtesy and respect the individual rights and respect the humanity of each of the people you're researching. beneficence, which means do good and don't do harm, and justice, which means treat all humans treat everyone equally, meaning that all humans are due the right to be treated as equal human beings, deserving of benefits of research and deserving of sharing the burdens of risk and not just being burdened with that. Okay. I've got rabbit hair in my nose. Okay, so moving on to the second major topic is privacy. One thing you'll note in these slides is I've used a coding style. So you can see here that many of them are large and underlined. Things that are underlined are key concepts for the week that will be accessible. Ones that are just large, like this word definition, tend to be just the topic of a slide. So that's the topic of slide 8. Yeah, so you can use this kind of code of underlines and large fonts to be able to follow the slides better. So okay, we're on slide 7 and we're going to talk about privacy. Briefly, we'll go through the definition, then we'll talk about two concepts and ways of protecting privacy, which are anonymity and confidentiality, and then we'll talk about what that practically means in data storage and in publishing. Okay, so let's get into it. In terms of the definition of privacy, it really is the idea that all human beings have the right to keep some things away from public view. You know, you have the right to keep pictures of your naked body away from public view. You have the right to keep your address private, except maybe from particular organizations like the tax department and maybe your employer if there's a legitimate reason. So that is what privacy is. It is the right that all humans have to keep some things away from public view. Some of the examples of the sort of privacy that we would respect would be around direct identifiers, so names, address, email. These should generally not be shared of participants. Indirect identifiers, so we might have, we also should respect the fact that sometimes you could tell a story or recount a series of events, and even though there's no names, addresses, or emails, etc. that are listed, you can work out who it is just because there are very few people who would have gone through that experience. And another one is that there's also a whole lot of things which you would expect privacy around. So things that any person might reasonably expect to be private. Accounts of illegal activities, stories that could embarrass or harm them. Note that there are some things which are generally not private, though again, this is not an absolute rule, but behavior in public places is generally not private. This is why it's generally legitimate to take photos of people in a park or such. And also, if you are able, just because you have the right to privacy doesn't mean you don't have the right to give it up. So there can be information that you, with informed consent, agree to share. So, you know, there's nothing stopping you legitimately posting, you know, pictures of your private things, whatever they are, so long as you've done that with informed consent. There's no problem with you handing over, as we'll talk about later, you know, your complete contact details, your answers to a whole lot of psychometric tests with your name and address, and the mapping of your entire DNA, which some people have done. It's part of a Harvard study. So you can give up your privacy, and that is fine. I guess it's not quite a non-example, but it is certainly privacy is something that you're allowed to legitimately give up if you can give informed consent. Okay, so how do we protect privacy? There are two main ways. The first one, and by far the most robust, is anonymity. Anonymity is the idea that you collect and store data so that even if people could access it, even if it was all made completely public, you couldn't identify who was part of it. So it's, and this means that like you remove all what I've put here, direct and indirect identifiers. So if you had interviews and you removed the names and addresses, if you made sure that none of the stories in the interview notes were very specific and contained enough information to identify people, if you had an audio recording of someone's voice and you used voice modification software to hide the pitch and style of the voice. And a non-example of anonymity is the next concept we're going to use, which is confidentiality. So if instead of going to protect privacy through anonymity, you decided to protect privacy through confidentiality, then with confidentiality you would store the names, addresses, and maybe detailed stories of abuse or mistreatment and so forth. And that would be a different way of protecting privacy. So let's talk about that. So confidentiality, we're going on to slide 10 here, is basically collecting and storing information so that only a limited number of people can access it. So you do this through things like password protected files, encrypting data, having researchers sign confidentiality agreements, which is probably what I'm going to have all of you do, so that you agree that even if you are revealed information, you won't pass it on. And so there are non-examples, so which particularly revolve around either when people give up their confidentiality or when confidentiality is breached. So in Singapore at the moment, there is a big controversy because the health department the government has the names of all 12,000 people in Singapore who have HIV, and some person who was a boyfriend of an employee at the health department stole those 12,000 names and left the country and has put them up on the internet. With names and addresses and even contact information, like who those people had sex with and so forth. I think. Don't quote me on that last one. You know, that is a gross breach of confidentiality, and you can imagine the harm that it would have, particularly in Singapore where there's virtually no laws to actually protect individuals from being sacked because they have HIV. Okay. We're going on to slide 11 now, and we're going to just talk about some of the key ways of protecting privacy and data storage. So you do things that we've already mentioned. You get researchers to sign confidentiality agreements. You de-identify the data, so make it anonymous. You use password protected files. You encrypt those files. You use secure data collection and storage. So for example, the ethics committee at Macquarie University wants us to use Qualtrics and not SurveyMonkey for surveys. A much more secure way of storing things is to put it in offline storage. So to the extent that you can store any information on a computer that's on the internet, there is some level of reduced security of that information because the computer could get hacked, even if it is password protected. For things like images, you can put them into zip folders and make those encrypted and password protected. A few other methods that can be used. I learned recently this week that one way another professor at Macquarie, or doctor at Macquarie, a teacher at Macquarie University uses to get really sensitive data from people who have, for example, about the sexuality of teens, is she creates an anonymous phone number and gives that number out to students to call. Sorry, it creates a phone number with, say, Telstra, and gives that number to students to call and leave a message on. And then, then when she downloads those messages, which is an audio recording, she uses voice modification software to de-identify the voice, and only then stores the voice modified, the modified version of the voice. And in that way, she still has actually the real people saying their real experiences, to the extent they're not lying, but it is completely protected and anonymized the data. Another way you can really simply avoid breaching, protecting, one way you can protect privacy is to just avoid video and audio recording. These tend to be a very simple way of breaching, a very simple way. Like if you have an audio recording or a video recording of someone, there is a good chance that they are going to be identifiable simply because voices are like a fingerprint of human beings. So to the extent you can avoid these and instead take notes, you've really set yourself up in a much better position. Okay, to protect the privacy of participants. Last slide in this section. So how do you protect privacy when you publish? Well, if you've got qualitative data, so interviews, you might only use small excerpts. If you've got quantitative data, then often you only publish aggregated data. So not the individual data of individuals, but rather the averages, the average age, the average number of people who have HIV, the average number of sexual partners of people, the average income of people, and maybe the standard deviations of those. And this aggregated data, of course, is not going to compromise the privacy of individuals. And to the extent that when you do share data, you try to make it so that people cannot be identified, make it anonymized by doing things like merging identifying fields. So instead of having age organized into years, you have by organized into 2 or 5 year brackets. You might amalgamate nationalities or religions, so you just have Christian or not Christian. And making sure with the idea that there is more than 1 or 2 people in each category so that they can't just be identified. A good example of this was when I did a study at my old university about 10 years ago, just in class, and one of the students was a Indian Muslim student, female, and she refused to do about half of a study that we did in class. It was only for class because she was literally the only Indian Muslim female in the class, and she would have been identified simply by her generic characteristics. Okay, so that's privacy and the key concepts around that. Moving on, the next section we're going to deal with is about informed consent. And what I've basically done here is when you're thinking about getting informed consent from someone, so what you would include in an informed consent form, so something that people would be read and agree to or would sign, this is a list of basically the key things that almost definitely have to be in every single informed consent. They are things like you must describe the study so people are informed of what they're doing. You need to describe the risks and benefits, again, so they know what they're getting themselves into. The length of the study, so how long are you going to be interviewing them? The simple reason for that is that that actually often one of the major costs to participants is simply standing there for 10 or 20 minutes or an hour and interviewing you rather than doing something better with their time. You need to list the privacy protections. You need to list the contact details of researchers. You also want to list the contact details of the ethics committee, the right of people to withdraw, how you get a copy of the research, and do you consent to participate. We'll just run through those very quickly. For the what I've used is an example from the informed consent that we'll be using in our study this semester. So you note here the description of the study is quite short and sweet. It's like 3 sentences. You're invited to participate in a study of working conditions. The purpose is to provide insights into the conditions of employees, and we hope to improve understanding, improve the law, and raise awareness of the problems of these employees. And then also we describe what the study is going to involve, which is a 10-minute survey about your conditions at work with some examples, saying such as your pay or working hours. These examples make it very concrete, and issues or problems they have so that they know what they're getting themselves in for. And we also might effect on your work outside of work, effect on your life outside work. So maybe how much sleep you get or what your living conditions are because of what you can afford to pay in rent. And it also says there'll be no audio video recording. So it's just a reassurance. The next thing another thing that we need to include is the risks and benefits. So these are the 2 sections on that from our informed consent. The risk says there's no expected risks, but then it goes into some details. We're deliberately conducting the research away from your place of work. If we are near your place of work or you believe we can be overheard by someone from your workplace, please let me know and we'll cease the survey. To protect both you and I, we ask you don't reveal names, companies, or the names of other acquaintances. This is a bit to avoid legal reporting issues and protect us as the researcher from having to choose between breaching privacy or going to jail, for example, or being fined, and protect them from being able to have anything that they say reported because we don't really know who they are. And then it reassures them, it says that all information will be anonymous and you'll not be identifiable in either the information we collect or in our publications. In terms of benefits, the key thing to say is if you're not paying them or they're not entering a lottery or such, there is no individual compensation. So in this case, there's no compensation. By helping, you'll be improving the understanding of conditions in your industry, and hopefully this will contribute to raising awareness amongst Australians about the issues you face. So there is a benefit to our study. The benefit is to the group that these workers are part of, the low-wage workers or workers in their particular industry, and it is that hopefully this research will help raise awareness. And it's important to state that. It's also because in a sense that reason will be a really important reason why people actually do the study in many cases. Then, as I mentioned, we need to mention the length of the study, simply because that 10 minutes is the major cost that they will pay. And I've got to say, ethics committees are very strict about needing to state that. Privacy protection. So as we've seen, privacy is a right that could easily be violated by researchers. And so in several different places in the ethics approval, in the informed consent, it states that your information will be anonymous and you'll not be identifiable. We'll also keep it confidential, except where required by law. So that's saying that, look, actually, if we are going to go to jail, we'll probably hand over your data. That just means that that's just because even if it was only me, maybe I would be prepared to go to jail, but I can't really guarantee that the 130 of you are all prepared to go to jail to protect the identity of the people you're surveying. It says no one will be identified, and then it says who will you share with, right? So it'll be shared with 6 or 7 students in our project group and our teachers led by Dr. Nicholas Harrigan. So that says who it's going to be shared with. Another bit of information is about the contact details. So twice in the survey it gives my contact details and my mobile phone number and my email address. It also provides information so that people can contact and complain to the ethics committee with their details. We'll actually also include in this the authorization number. That's not in there at the moment, but it will be included so that it'll make it very easy for the ethics committee to identify which groups had any breach, if there is any. Okay. To make it informed consent, you need to remind people that they can say no. So this is where you say participation is voluntary, you are not obliged to participate, and if you decide to participate, you're free to withdraw at any time. So they can stop at any time without giving a reason and without any consequences. That's crucial. Another thing that you have to include in almost all informed consents is if you want a copy of our research, how can they get it? Because this is about empowerment, and this is about making sure that people who are doing part of the research can actually find out about how it's used. So we're building a website, Ryan and I, called experiencesofwork.com, where participants can find out more information about the study and also sign up to the survey and even sign up to be part of follow-up studies. And then the last question that you ask is, do you consent to participate? Which the best way to phrase it is, do you understand what I've just said? And if so, do you agree to participate in this study? And the reason you do this is you don't just say, do you agree? But rather you say it in full, and because you want to give them a chance to really clearly say no if they're uncomfortable. Okay, so that's the third topic. Moving on to the fourth topic, which is I've just called other fundamental concepts. It's basically miscellaneous stuff. So we're on slide 22, and we're going to go through the issue of deception, illegal and unethical, which are very different concepts, some basic issues around safety of researchers, legal reporting obligations, the types of harm, so you're aware of the types of harm that you could do to people as a researcher, and also how we deal with vulnerable populations and what the main vulnerable populations are. So deception is basically lying to people or omitting crucial information. It is actually acceptable. It's used by a lot of psychologists because if you tell people what you're studying, you can change their answers. In our study, it's not a problem. But if, for example, you wanted to say, I want to see the effects of shock or fear on your morality of your behavior, if I tell you that at the beginning of an experiment, it's going to change how you react, often change how your ethics and morality is affected by fear because you'll be looking out for it. So in many psychological experiments, they deceive people. They say, hi, we're bringing you in to, taste, tell us which of these fruit juices tastes better, but then in the middle of it something happens and scares the hell out of them, and then they measure the reaction. Now, the deal with deception is that there are some things that you really always need to do. One is there needs to be no other method possible for doing it. Also, it's not on this list, but the deception should be the smallest amount needed to achieve the result. And you should also obtain permission after the experiment. So basically, after you have scared them or deceived them or made them go through this experience, at the end you say, look, hi, we lied. That's what the debrief is, the third point. But also you say, look, if you're really upset with what we've done and don't think it's a worthwhile use of your time, your resources, it's been unfair, we will throw this data away. And so it's retrospective consent to the collection of the data, and it's a really good check because it means that the individual will, in a sense, has a chance to reassert autonomy over the experiment that they were forced to go through. Another really crucial concept in dealing with ethics is that what is illegal is not necessarily unethical, and what is unethical is not necessarily illegal. So, for example, what is unethical can be legal. Internet pranks. There are all these YouTube videos you can download and search that are on. They're often called social experiments or such, right? And honestly, they're terrible. You know, they're like people going and pretending to rob someone at an ATM machine, right? Or someone going on a date and then their supposed ex-boyfriend finds out on it and comes in with a gun and threatens to kill the guy. You know, or you do a fake shooting in front of people and you think that you just killed someone or someone just died in front of you. Now, most of those things are not really illegal, or like they're not likely to lead to legal harm. Maybe they are. Some of them are illegal, but not all of them. But they're definitely what an ethics committee and what researchers in universities would consider unethical. Often because there's no real research merit, they're not done with the best standards, they're not proving anything new, they're not being done to make sure that you really protect the participant and using the least amount of deception possible, and they do tend to cause harm. They're going to cause some level of a lasting emotional harm to the people for no good reason. So you can have legal stuff, but it's unethical. And I just want to say there's a kind of a word, which I'm going to swear just to warn people, not badly, but there's a really good word that is recommended by actually some Harvard professors for describing people who are nasty and so forth. And I think it's a good word because what's the colloquial word for someone who is unethical? I think the colloquial word, and this is where I'll swear, is asshole. Right? And that's a nice one to use because it's not sexist, like almost every other word that we would use to describe a despicable person or a despicable act. So if you want a real shorthand for what is ethics, it's about not being an asshole. Okay, end of little lecture on that. Okay, the other thing is that what is illegal can be ethical. So in many places in the world, participating in protests or working with protesters is illegal, right? Go to Saudi Arabia, go to parts of China. You will learn very quickly about it. Go to Singapore. One person holding a A4 sheet of paper is illegal. Now, would any ethics committee say that it is unethical? Very unlikely, unless they're from Saudi Arabia or China, and they probably don't really think it's unethical. They just want to protect themselves under an authoritarian regime. The US, it has been illegal to travel to Cuba at various points. And often doing research on authoritarian governments is illegal. But are these things unethical? Generally not. So the key thing here is that what is unethical can be legal, what is illegal can be ethical. These are not the same thing, and it's crucial that you understand this. I'll give you one simple example actually. You are going to do data collection, and one of the options is to go to food courts in shopping centers. Now, that could be seen as a breach of private property and the rules of the shopping center. The ethics committee does not care, right, about that. And actually, I've had that discussion with them. I said, it's not an ethical issue. I said, so long as they're sensible about how they, try and interview people, and if they don't get angry and they just obey instructions from security to leave when they do, it's not a big deal. And ethics committee agreed. So, interesting. Okay. Another sort of miscellaneous point is about safety of researchers. This is not strictly within the remit of ethics committees, though often they do, because ethics committees and research ethics is about participants. It's about protecting the interests of people who are the subjects of research. However, it is important for researchers to be safe, and often ethics committees take interest in this, and they've taken a particular interest in your safety with respect to this research. There's actually a huge list of things that you are going to be advised to do to protect your safety, and we have a whole bulletin on this, but I will just give a couple of examples of that. So see the safety information sheet for these projects that we've done, but also don't go into people's homes. You'll just increase the chances of being somehow physically harmed. Don't make sure you do collect data in pairs, right? So if you collect data in pairs and you've at least got sight of each other, you've got less likelihood of being mistreated or harassed or getting yourself into a difficult situation. And also, unless there's a really good reason, the research committee advises, and I think this is right, don't collect data after dusk. It's just a little bit more dangerous to go to places where at nighttime. That's not an absolute rule. Like, you may need to do research. You may decide you want to do research on workers in nightclubs, right? Or you may decide that you want to go and interview construction workers after work at a bar. Ethics committee is broadly okay with that, so long as you do so with some safety. But in general, if there's not a very good reason for it, you shouldn't collect data after dusk. That's in your cases. It's not an absolute rule. Okay, another issue, just miscellaneous issue that you should be aware of, is legal reporting obligations. So some laws in some jurisdictions have reporting obligations. Generally, you have an obligation to report child sex offences. I'm not 100% sure what the law is in New South Wales with respect to that, but generally, if someone is about to be murdered, like imminent harm, or there is a child sex offence, you're generally got some obligation to report. In New South Wales, there's an obligation to report indictable offences, i.e. those with more than a 5-year prison term. That is very unique to New South Wales. It not applies in many other states, and it doesn't apply in many other jurisdictions in the world. However, two things to note about this law, right? I think we would generally encourage you to not be breaching the privacy of participants unless you felt an ethical and moral obligation to do that, or you felt that you were really particularly likely to come into legal harm. It will ultimately be up to you, because you've told them that if you have to comply with the law, you'll report it, but it's still dubious whether you should do it. There's a few things to note. The law in New South Wales actually has special, it's not exclusions, but conditions for prosecuting researchers and other people. And it's apparently never been enforced against researchers in New South Wales. So in a sense, it's a law that's on the books, but it's not used. Also, the New South Wales Law Reform Commission, which is a semi-government body, has actually recommended that this law be repealed. So it's not seen as a very good law by a lot of legally informed persons of high status in New South Wales. Another example of a legal obligation to report is if the Federal Minister for Immigration, Peter Dutton at the moment, or it's actually another guy as well, David Campbell? I can't, what's his name? Anyway, doesn't matter. These people, these ministers can force persons to give information about the illegal activities of non-citizens. So if we had information about an international student who worked more than 20 hours per week, there's a possibility that any of us as researchers could be forced to give that information to the Minister of Immigration. Again, we are not aware of any cases where this has actually been used against researchers, and there are good reasons to think that it wouldn't be, but you should be aware of it. The way we're dealing with that in our research, and the general recommendation, is that if you're likely to collect information about illegal activities, arrange so you don't know the names or addresses of participants. So you can do this by interviewing anonymous people on the street who don't tell you their name, which is what one of the things we're going to do. Or, and I've seen this with previous researchers, they organize for a third party to arrange the interview and don't ask for names of the people they're interviewing. So you have one set of people who organize the interviews, who don't know what happens in the interviews, and another set of researchers who do the interviews and don't know the names of people but know what is said. And this separation means that no one has enough information that would be reportable or be able to be obtained from them through coercion by the state, through threats of jail time or such. Okay, slide number 27, types of harm. I just want to briefly tell you what do research committees and university ethics consider harm to be. And there are 5 main types of harm that I think are worth being aware of. They are psychological harm. That is one risk that you will have with your participants. Psychological harm can come from things like having emotional distress from recalling incidents and becoming aware of, so if you ask workers about how have you been treated at work, and they start talking about their abusive employer and start crying and getting upset and saying, I don't know how to deal with it, you've in a sense created a level of psychological harm there, or through emotional distress. In our case, the recommendation to you will be that if the person you're interviewing starts to become emotionally distressed, you should do 2 things. One is attempt to end the survey appropriately. Number 2, say to them that, look, you're not qualified to deal with it, which you're not. And number 3, you will have a list of contact details and of support services that they can contact to get help, and you would recommend they contact those and give them the list of support services. Another type of harm, which is sort of obvious, is physical harm, so risk of injury or death or pain. There's also legal harm, so we've dealt with that a lot already, but someone could get sued by the police or by the law, go to jail or get fined. So drug users, drug dealers, people who admit crimes are all at risk of legal harm. There's also the risk of social harm. So if I get you to, you do a research and you get some people to tell you who has, have you cheated on your partner, and then I accidentally make that data public with your name and address, then that has a significant risk of damage to your relationship and possibly damage to your reputation as well. And then the last one, which is economic harm and job loss, and we do face that, and that's why you're not interviewing anyone at their workplaces and why you are reminding them that they shouldn't be overheard by anyone in their workplaces. Okay, last point in this set of slides, slide number 28, vulnerable populations. So another name for vulnerable populations is special populations. The main types of special populations that we tend to deal with as researchers are students, i.e. you, prison inmates, employees, military personnel, homeless people, welfare recipients, children, and the disabled. Also pregnant women often fits under there because their fetus is not able to consent. But that's generally an issue for medical research. Look, there are a couple of things about these groups. One is, the main thing is that they can't necessarily give free informed consent. Children are not old enough to. Mentally disabled persons are not necessarily able to because they can't be informed. People like students, prison inmates, employees, military personnel, homeless, and welfare recipients are in a power imbalance, which makes it difficult for them to say no. So if I forced you to participate, I'm not forcing you to participate in a study, I'm forcing you to be researchers, just to say. But if I forced you to be a participant in a study, as students, I would need to give you an option to do something else. And that would simply because you are not free to say no. In the case of this class, actually, the ethics committee has ruled that you are free to not take this class if you don't want to collect data and be part of this, because it is clearly stated in the unit outline that this is how the class is being run. And so what do you do to protect special populations? One is getting permission from a legal guardian, and the second one is to have extra protections from harm, and also extra ways of obtaining consent, so that you for students, for example, if an academic is going to research students, they need to give them an assessment task that does not collect the data. So if I had an assessment that involved you having to participate in one of my studies, I need to offer you an option to do another research activity that does not involve participating in my study. Okay, so that's the end of basically the miscellaneous or other fundamental concepts. Going back, we've dealt with 4 major topics. I'm just going to end now very quickly by pointing out what has been put up on iLearn, which is some of the key documents for our studies. These are put up, they're only each about a page long, so it's not a lot of reading. But there is the informed consent form. There's also a protocol for safe and ethical data collection about how you keep yourself safe and how you make sure you do ethical data collection. There's a page protocol on how to do safe data storage using things like passwords and encryption. And also there is not constant information, but contact information for support services. So there's lists of contact details for contacting trade unions, for contacting the Fair Work Ombudsman, for contacting suicide prevention services like Lifeline, for contacting homeless people who can provide help with homelessness, people who can provide help with sexual assault and rape, and so forth. The key thing about all of these is I'm not going to go into detail about them now, but you should review them and be familiar with their contents. And if you have any questions, ask me about them. Okay, that's the end of this lecture. I hope that's been clear and straightforward. Do give feedback to tell me whether this is the style, this is a better and easier style of lecture to follow. Note that I'll be putting the PowerPoint slides of screenshots of each of those slides up on the iLearn as well, so you can actually follow along listening to my voice and reading through the slides yourself rather than watching a video. And also, I should have said this at the beginning, but if you can't read the slides and you're watching the YouTube video, make sure you have set the resolution in the bottom right hand corner of the YouTube to the highest high definition resolution. If YouTube has downgraded the resolution to very like a very low resolution, then these videos are going to appear incredibly pixelated. Okay, thanks very much for listening to me, and I will see you in class. And again, I'm sorry this is late. Bye.